Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
European Union Withdrawal Bill, consideration of Lord's message.
Now. Thank you. Order. We begin with the government motion to agree to Lord's amendments 19C to 19E, 19G to 19L and 19P, and to propose amendments to Lord's Amendment 19P. With this, we will consider all the remaining Lord's amendments as listed on the selection paper. I inform the House that I have selected Manuscript Amendment B in the name of Mr. Dominic Grieve and Amendment A in the name of Mr. Tom Brake. I would add, for the convenience of the House, that copies of Manuscript Amendment B are available in the vote office. I call to move the motion the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Secretary David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will turn in a moment to the issue which will be at the forefront of many honourable members' minds. That is Parliament's role at the conclusion of the negotiations with the European Union. But first I want to set out the other issues which are before the House for approval today. These are all issues where the Lords agreed with the Government on Monday. That is, enhanced protection of certain areas of EU law, family reunification for refugee children, and extending sifting arrangements for SIs to the Lords. The Government set out common sense approaches to these three issues in the Lords, who backed the Government, and the issues now return to this House for final approval. The fourth issue is, as I have said, Parliament's role at the conclusion of our negotiations with the European Union. Before we turn to the detail, let us take a step back for a moment and consider the long democratic process we've been on to get here. It began with the European Union Referendum Act, passed by a majority of 263 in this House, and at which point the Government was clear it would respect the outcome of the referendum, followed by the referendum itself, which saw a turnout of over 33 million people. 17.4 million people voted in favour of leaving the European Union. We then had the European Union Notification of Withdrawal Bill, which empowered the Government to trigger Article 50, and despite the attempts of some in the other place to impugn the validity of this notification, that bill also passed both houses with a majority of 372, in this place voting for third reading. This was followed by a general election where both major parties, attracting over 80% of the vote, stood on manifestos which committed to respecting the result of the referendum. 27.5 million votes for parties that said they would respect the referendum. No ifs, no buts. And while we're now in the process of passing this essential bill to get our statute book ready for the day we leave, it will ensure we respect the referendum result, but exit the European Union in as smooth and orderly manner as possible. We've already set out in law that this process will be followed by a motion to approve the final deal we agree with the European Union in negotiations. If this is supported by Parliament, and I hope and expect it will be, the Government will introduce the Withdrawal Agreement and Implementation Bill, which Parliament will have time to debate, vote on and amend if they so wish. Finally, as with any international treaty, the withdrawal agreement will be subject to the approval and ratification procedures under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. And this is all before we even consider the other pieces of legislation we have and will pass as a part of this process. So anyone who questions the democratic credentials of the Government or of this process should consider the steps that we have taken to get to this stage and those which we have already laid out in front of us. I believe they're greater than any steps taken for any international negotiation ever in the history of this country. Now, furthermore to that, to what was said in the other place on Monday, this gives Parliament significantly more rights than we see on the European Union side. The European Parliament simply has to consent to the withdrawal agreement, a yes or no vote, and the EU member states will simply have a vote in Council on the withdrawal agreement. So we have considerably more powers than them too. Now let me now turn to the detail of the amendment at hand. We start with a simple purpose. How do we guarantee Parliament's role in scrutinising the government in the unlikely event that the preferred scenario does not come to pass? Our intention is straightforward: to conclude negotiations later this year and put before both houses a deal that's worthy of support. In approaching our discussions on this matter, the government set out 3 reasonable tests. They are that we do not undermine the negotiations, we do not alter the constitutional role of Parliament in relation to international negotiations, and we respect the result of the referendum. It's on this basis that we have tabled our amendment in lieu. It's a fair and serious proposal which demonstrates the significant flexibility that the government has already shown in addressing the concerns of this House. Our original amendment provided that if Parliament rejects the final deal, the government must make a statement setting out its next steps in relation to negotiations within 28 days of that rejection. Our new amendment now provides for a statement and a motion, ensuring there's a guaranteed opportunity for both houses to express their views on the government's proposed next steps. Not only that, but we've also expanded the set of circumstances in which that opportunity would arise to cover the 3 situations conceived of by my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield Amendment, last week. Firstly, if Parliament rejects the deal, a statement must now be made within 21 days, and a motion must be tabled in both houses within 7 sitting days of that amendment, of that statement. Alternatively, if the Prime Minister announces before the 21st of January 2019 that no deal can be agreed with the European Union, a statement must be made within 14 days, and a motion must be tabled in both houses within 7 days of that statement. Finally, if no agreement has been reached by the end of the 21st of January 2019, a statement must be made within 5 days, and a motion must be tabled in both houses within 5 sitting days. That would happen whatever the state of negotiations at that stage. I will give way to the Chairman of the Brexit Committee.
When he recently appeared before the Select Committee, the right honourable gentleman confirmed that the motion asking the House to approve the withdrawal agreement would be amendable. Can he therefore explain to the House why the government is now proposing amendments to the Lord's Amendment to include the reference to neutral terms, when the right honourable gentleman will be very well aware that Standing Order 24B of the House says that if a motion is considered by Mr. Speaker to be in neutral terms, then it cannot be amended. Why is the government prepared to allow an amendable motion in one case, but not in the dire circumstances that he is now describing?
Well, he prefaced it perfectly with the rest of my speech, because that's precisely what I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes explaining to him. Now, the point where we're at there is that the initial provisions speak for themselves. Our proposed amendment creates a formal structure set out in law for Parliament to express its views in all of the various scenarios that might come to pass in our exit from the European Union. But it also, not for the moment, but it also passes 3 tests set out by myself and the Prime Minister. Now, I'm glad to see that the amendment sent back to us by the other place accepts the vast majority of these provisions. The core of the disagreement now focuses on the exact nature of the motion offered to the House if any of the unfortunate circumstances I previously mentioned come to pass. Our amendment offers those motions in neutral terms. Questions have focused understandably on whether that means they would not be amendable. Honourable members will of course be aware it's not within the competence of government to judge whether amendments can be tabled to motions. But for clarity, I quote from Standing Order 24B of the House of Commons, which states, "Where, in the opinion of the Speaker of the Chair, a motion that this House has considered the matter is expressed in neutral terms, no amendments to it may be tabled." I've written to the Chairman of the Procedure Committee setting out how the government understands this process will operate in practice, and I've laid a copy of that letter in the libraries of both houses. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm enormously grateful to the Secretary of State for allowing me to make an intervention in this early part of his contribution, this important contribution this afternoon. I really am most unhappy with the repetition by the Prime Minister and others in government with this mantra, no deal is better than a bad deal. So I would like the Secretary of State to give a guarantee to the people of Northern Ireland that the government that he represents here today will not be gambling with the constitutional status of Northern Ireland as an integral part of the United Kingdom, because no deal would lead to a hard border which would be inevitably exploited by Sinn Féin and by new IRA dissidents. I need that guarantee.
You should be quite sure we won't be gambling with the status of the border, and I'll come back to the issue of no deal in a moment, because that is central to much of the issue of the amendability of motions. I will give way to my honourable friend first, and then my right honourable friend second.
Isn't the importance, I suggest to my right honourable friend, isn't the importance of the position that the government is taking, is that if a no-deal option is ruled out, it guarantees a worse deal in any negotiation. Anyone who has been party to a negotiation will understand that.
Yes. Well, he is right, and it's a point I'm going to come back to in a second. I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. In the satisfactory amendment that left the House of Lords, the government would be obliged to put forward a substantive motion if its agreement was to be rejected. No doubt it would draft that with a view to commanding the majority of the House, but other people could put forward a substantive amendment with alternative proposals as to how to proceed. Now, he rejects that, and he's trying to replace it with the situation where the government doesn't have to put anything in its second amendment except that it takes note. And then, if anybody tries to put a substantial motion forward as an amendment, I'll give you £1 to a penny, Mr. Speaker, that the argument will be faced, if you pass this, it'll just mean no deal, because the government's not going to negotiate this, and it'll bring the thing to an end. And I cannot for the life of me see why the government is hesitating about the Lord's Amendment, except, of course, that it's come under tremendous pressure from hardline Brexiteers under the government, who caused the government to reject the perfectly satisfactory understanding that had been reached with honourable members on this side who had doubts last week.
Well, I'm afraid I don't agree with my right honourable friend. He will be unsurprised to hear. I don't try and follow him down the path of what might happen under what circumstances. I will explain in a moment. I will explain in a moment, Mr. Speaker. I will explain in a moment the reasoning behind the restriction of amendment, which is precisely accurate about this in this area. But I do not follow him down his path, and I say to him this: he has been in the House even longer than me, and he knows full well that very often, when the matters are very important, the procedural mechanism of the motion doesn't actually determine its power or its effect. Going right back to the Norway debate, which was on an adjournment motion put down by the Chief Whip of the day and changed the course of the war. So I don't take his point at all. Now, the amendment sent to us by the other place does not offer those motions in neutral terms. It's therefore possible, indeed I would predict likely, that wide-ranging amendments will be tabled which would seek to instruct the government on how to proceed in relation to our European Union withdrawal. Now, this might seem like a minor point of procedure, but it's integral to the nature of those motions and whether they pass the three tests I set out last week. Now, these debates and amendments in the last week have revolved around what happened in the event of no deal. And I say to the chairman of the Brexit Committee, the distinction between the motion that we promised the House, and I think I first promised him right back in the Article 50 debate, is it comes about if the House rejects the circumstances of a deal. These others apply principally to the issue of no deal, and that's really rather different. Now, let me be clear, and this is in response to the Honourable Lady. I have never argued in favour of no deal. I do not favour no deal. I will do what I can to avoid no deal. It's not an outcome we are seeking. As it stands, I am confident we will achieve a deal which this Parliament can support, as it stands. But you cannot enter a negotiation. You cannot enter the negotiation without a right to walk away. If you do, it rapidly ceases to be a negotiation. So the Lord's Amendment undermines the strength of the United Kingdom in negotiations. Now, there are plenty of voices on the European side of negotiations who seek to punish us, let's be very clear, and to do us harm, who wish to present us an unambiguously bad deal. some to dissuade others from following us, and others who would do so with the intention of reversing the referendum or making us lose our nerve and rejoin the European Union. If it undermines the UK's ability to walk away, this amendment makes this outcome more likely. This is the paradox. I'll give away 1 second. This is the paradox. In trying to head off no deal, and it's important to the Honourable Lady too, in trying to head off no deal, you actually make no deal more likely, and that's what we're trying to avoid. I'll give away to my honourable friend.
My right honourable friend agree that where we have members on the opposite benches whose constituencies, like mine in Stoke-on-Trent South, voted strongly to leave, that we must ensure that they vote with us and vote to stop these amendments here tonight.
Well, I take his point, but I've always at this dispatch box and elsewhere insisted that people vote with their consciences, and that conscience should encompass how they represent the wishes of their constituents. Now, if the European Union expect Parliament to direct the government to reconsider its policies, to extend Article 50 or even to revoke it, they'll have an incentive to delay and give us the worst possible deal just to try to make such an outcome happen. I'm not going to be away for the moment, Mr. Speaker, so I hope you'll take that on board. This is already clear from the European Union's approach so far in some areas of negotiations. We've seen their inflexibility in their approach to Galileo. We've even seen it yesterday in their inflexibility in their approach to internal security generally. Furthermore, we have seen it firsthand, my team and I, whenever something happens in the Commons or the Lords that increases uncertainty, negotiations slow down. When they believe we might be forced to change our position to suit them, they stall. We cannot allow such an approach to become commonplace across all negotiations. Now, while I'm glad that we have moved away from the proposition that Parliament can give unilateral, wide-ranging, legally binding instructions to the government in international matters, an amendable motion nevertheless countenances a situation in which Parliament can direct the government on how it should proceed. There is a clear difference between government taking Parliament's view into account as expressed through a debate and Parliament instructing the government how to act. That difference is reflected in the two amendments on offer today. Finally, the amendment by the other place could be used to undermine the result of the referendum. The noble Viscount Lord Hailsham willingly admits he believes the decision of the British people in 2016 was, in his words, a national calamity. Lord Billamora spoke in terms previously when he described it as a no-Brexit amendment. This amendment is consistent with our belief. It sets out in law a clear path to follow those who wish to frustrate the withdrawal from the European Union. Our amendment, on the other hand, is consistent with the notion that it's right for Parliament... It is right for Parliament to express its view, but not to instruct the government on how to conduct itself in an international negotiation. As I have said, it passes the three tests set out by myself and the Prime Minister. I'll give way to Honourable Gentleman.
Just before I come to the intervention, point of order. I hope it isn't a point of frustration. Mr. Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading here in the media for the first time a ministerial statement from the Secretary of State purporting to explain how neutral terms would operate in practice, and I assume that you've seen the statement, Mr. Speaker. It says, under the standing orders of the House of Commons, it will be for the Speaker to determine whether a motion, when it's introduced by the government under the European Union Withdrawal Bill, is or is not in fact cast in neutral terms, and hence whether the motion is or is not amendable. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, my question to you is, what discretion does that leave you in practice if such a motion is cast in time-honoured neutral terms in the first place?
The discretion that I've always had in such circumstances is the short answer to the honourable gentleman. This matter may or may not be treated of further at a later point in our proceedings, but I don't want to detract from the time available for the debate. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. And I think the Secretary of State had given way to his honourable friend, the member for Shipley. Mr. Philip Davis.
I'm very grateful. Would my right honourable friend commend our honourable friend, the member for Bracknell, who on the radio today, with his characteristic openness, said that he hoped that if our right honourable and learned friend's amendment was passed today, he hoped that the House would use that in order to suspend Article 50 being triggered, which actually let the cat out of the bag of what the motive is, which is to delay, frustrate or even stop altogether the UK leaving the European Union.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said throughout this, it's for people to go with their consciences on this matter, and I don't attack anybody for doing that. May I just pick up on the point of order that was raised with you, because I would not want the House to think that in any way they had not been told about this. Because in my speech earlier, I outlined the issue of the Erskine May on this matter, Standing Order 24B, and your rights in this, and made it plain that that's what we're relying upon. So I wouldn't want the House to be misled in any way, that, or believe they've been misled. Now, Mr. Speaker, debates on this issue have been the finest traditions of this House. Honourable members have stood on issues of principle, argued their cases with the utmost integrity. It shifted the government's approach to a position where our Parliament will rightly and unquestionably have its say and express its view. For in this, the greatest democracy of all, we debate, we argue, we make our cases with passion, but we do it to a purpose, and that is to deliver for our people, not just to please ourselves. They decided we'll leave the European Union, and whatever the European Union think about that, we'll do it, and we'll do it the best way we can. And in that spirit, I commend this motion to the House. I beg to...
Order. The question is that this House agrees with the Lords in their amendments 19C to 19E, 19G to 19L and 19P, and proposes the amendments to Lords Amendment 19P as on the amendment paper. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak in favour of the amendment tabled by the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield to preserve Lord's Amendment 19P, which ensures Parliament a meaningful vote in the Brexit process. Mr. Speaker, we need to be clear what this amendment is and what it is not. It is not about frustrating or blocking Brexit. It is not about tying the hands of the UK negotiators, and it would not empower Parliament to direct the government in the ongoing negotiations. It is simply about this House playing a meaningful role in the terms of the final Brexit deal. It's about making sure that on the most important peacetime issue this House has faced for a generation, this House is not silenced. This amendment addresses two simple questions. What happens if Parliament rejects the Prime Minister's proposed Article 50 deal in the autumn? And what happens if by the 21st of January next year there is no Article 50 deal or no prospect of an Article 50 deal? The Prime Minister has said consistently, tough luck. If you don't like my proposed deal, you can have something much worse. That is not meaningful. The Brexit Secretary, once a great guardian of the role of this House, now wants to sideline Parliament when its voice is most needed. He says that in the event that the Prime Minister's proposed Article 50 deal is rejected by Parliament, or there's no Article 50 deal, a minister will make a statement. Well, I should think so. After 2 years of negotiation, the government brings back a deal which is rejected, and a minister will make a statement. And he says, not in 28 days, but 21. 21 days. That's democracy. That's giving Parliament a real voice.
Greatest Parliament.
And then, a further safeguard. There will be a neutral motion. Well, there's an example of a neutral motion, Mr. Speaker, on the order paper today. There's to be a debate about NATO. Very important. And what will be decided is this, that this House has considered NATO. Yeah. That's the additional safeguard, that this House has considered the Article 50 deal. And that's it. That's the role of this House on the most important decision that we'll make in this Parliament. No one who values parliamentary sovereignty should accept either approach, and that's why this amendment is crucial. It requires the government to back up any statement made by a minister with a motion that can be voted on,
It permits Parliament to have a meaningful say, but only after negotiations are complete. Mr. Speaker, of course, the very idea of Parliament actually having a say prompts the usual cries, and I've no doubt many of the interventions will be along these lines, so let me deal with them. The usual cries are these. It's an attempt to frustrate Brexit. It will weaken the Prime Minister's negotiating hand. Parliament cannot micromanage the negotiation. So let me meet those objections. First, we've heard it all before. Yes. In August 2016, we challenged the government to produce a plan. Oh, yes. What did they say? That will frustrate Brexit. Yeah. It will tie our hands. It'll play into the hands of the EU. Yeah. And then they had to accept a motion to produce a plan, and the sky didn't fall in. Yeah. In the autumn of 2016, we challenged the government to give members of this House a vote on the proposed Article 50 deal. The same response from the same people across this House. It'll frustrate the process. It'll tie the Prime Minister's hands. It'll play into the hands of the EU. And then what? Lancaster House speech, January 2017. Prime Minister agrees to give MPs a vote, and the sky did not fall in. December 2017, we challenged the government to put the Article 50 vote into legislation. It was contested. Amendment 7. The usual reasons, the usual response. It'll frustrate Brexit. It'll play into the hands of the EU. It'll tie the Prime Minister's hands. Amendment 7 was voted against the government vet, and the sky did not fall in. And in February of this year, Mr. Speaker, we challenged the government to publish the impact assessments. The usual response. It'll frustrate Brexit. It'll tie the Prime Minister's hands. It'll play into the hands of the EU. And then the impact assessments were published, and the sky did not fall in. So this amendment is not about frustrating the process. It's about making sure there is a process. Second, Mr. Speaker, we have to confront this. The biggest threat to an orderly Brexit and the biggest threat of no deal is and always has been division at the heart of government. They cannot agree the fundamentals. The customs arrangements is hardly an unexpected issue that was going to arise. No one should be under any illusion that the EU somehow cannot see the fundamental weakness in the government's position. I do give way, and I'll give way over.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for giving way. Will the Shadow Secretary of State confirm that the Labour Party is not trying to frustrate Brexit, and in fact, the Labour Party policy and the policy of our front bench is that we will be leaving the European Union in March 2019.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I know how important that is for the honourable member in her constituency, and I can confirm that position, which has always been our position. Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I thank him for at least allowing somebody from this side to have an intervention which the Secretary of State didn't have the decency to do. Could my right honourable friend explain what on earth a meaningful vote can mean if it's a Hobson's choice Brexit, the deal we've done, or no deal at all? And isn't that Hobson's choice Brexit and avoiding it what this entire debate is now about?
Absolutely. I'm grateful for that intervention, because that goes to the heart of the issue. Parliament to be given a vote on Article 50, and if you don't like what the Prime Minister's brought back, you can have something much worse. A child would see through that as not an acceptable choice. I will give way.
Doesn't it come down to this, though, and perhaps the benches opposite are missing the central point? In any negotiation, if you rule out a no deal, it guarantees a worst outcome. Anyone who has conducted a negotiation in business understands that. If the opposition benches don't understand that, then they're missing the central point.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I've always been curious about this tactic. What happens at the end of the negotiation is that if there's no deal, is that you are pushed over a cliff. Yes. Volunteering to jump first has never appeared to me to be a great tactic. But no, because I want to complete this point. No, not yet, because I want to complete the answer. No deal was never a credible threat. And as each day goes past, it's less credible. There is no immigration law that can come into force in March 2019. There are no staff to administer it. There's no customs arrangements. There's no infrastructure. If we don't have a deal, we don't have any arrangements for law and security. It is not a credible threat, and therefore this whole notion that we have to pretend we're going to do something which is incredible has no bargaining impact. I'm going to make some progress, if I may. No. Mr. Speaker, the third point that's taken against our position is based on the proposition, and this is the argument that this somehow passes an advantage to the EU. It's based on the proposition that but for this amendment, the Prime Minister would, undisturbed in her course, take us out of the EU without a deal. That she would calmly and with the full support of this House head for the cliff of no deal. That seems to be extremely unlikely. This amendment is about what happens at the end of the negotiations, not the beginning. It allows Parliament to have a meaningful role once the negotiations are over, and it does not tie the government's hands during the negotiations. But it does mean that the course the government takes in the event that the Article 50 is voted down or there's no deal has to be supported by a majority in this House. Standing back, Mr. Speaker, that is common sense. It is unthinkable that any Prime Minister would seek to force through a course of action with significant consequences for many, many years, which the majority in this House did not approve of. That is unthinkable. That is unthinkable. And the idea that that is how you would achieve an orderly Brexit is for the birds. What this amendment does is to provide order where otherwise there would be utter chaos. And for those reasons, I urge honourable and right honourable members on all sides to support the amendment tabled by the right honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield to preserve Lord's Amendment 19p. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Order to move Manuscript Amendment B. I call Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to you for having enabled this amendment to be considered this afternoon by accepting my manuscript. It's a very odd aspect, and I have to say very unsatisfactory aspect of the way our Parliament does its business, that we can end up on ping-pong frequently debating amendments that are in fact irrelevant to what the House is really troubled about. In order to get to this point, I have to tell the House it's been necessary to also twist the rules of procedure in the other place, and I am immensely grateful to those peers who facilitated the manuscript amendment that took place there and enabled us this afternoon for the first time to consider the issue of the meaningful vote in relation both to the government's view of what it should be and the suggestion that had come from their Lordships' House. And I'd like to say here and now how deeply I object to the way in which they get vilified for doing the job that we have asked them to do, which is to act as a revising chamber and to send back to this House proposals for our consideration. Mr. Speaker, the issue has been highlighted by the earlier speakers is about the form that a meaningful vote should take. There are two options in front of the House. The House will recall that when this matter first arose last week, the amendment that had come from the Lords included a mandatory element. something which I have to say is rather constitutionally unusual. I don't think it's happened since the Civil War in the 17th century. And I'm not sure it ended very well. I seem to recall it ended with this bauble from Oliver Cromwell in relation to the mace. And because of that, I certainly considered that it was excessive, and I apologise to the House that in trying to produce something else, I probably didn't, very late at night last week, draft as well as I might have done. But it led to a sensible discussion prompted by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who had a number of us in her room and said she would do her best to meet the concerns we were expressing on there not being a meaningful vote on no deal. Last Thursday, I have to tell the House, it looked as if we were going to reach an agreement based on exactly the terms of the Lord's amendment that has come back to us. But at a very late stage, it was indicated to me that the government didn't feel able to proceed with that. I'd like to emphasise that I make absolutely no criticism of those with whom I negotiated and who behaved impeccably in this matter. Indeed, at the end of the day, I have to accept that sometimes negotiations may founder at the last minute. But it was unfortunate. It was unfortunate from my point of view, and I'll come back to that point briefly in a moment. But be that as it may, the government's tabled amendment was the one that we are being asked to accept today. The one which simply asks us to note and doesn't give us the opportunity of amending. Two arguments have been put to me to justify this change when it occurred and in the negotiations that followed. The first one was that there was concern about the justiciability of the amendment. It's right to say that the standing orders of the House cannot, in my view, be impugned in any court outside this High Court of Parliament. But it's right to say that if one puts reference to the standing orders into a statute, it can raise some very interesting, if somewhat arcane, legal issues about the extent to which a challenge could be brought. My own view on this is I don't believe that the amendment, which is currently the Lord's amendments come to us, is credibly open to challenge. And for that matter, I happen to think that the government amendment is not credibly open to challenge either, although it's worth pointing out to the House that it is as credibly, or is as likely to be challenged or capable of being challenged as the other. So I don't accept a differentiation between them. Yeah. That was the first argument. The second argument that was put forward was of a very different kind. It was said to me, and I think it was picked up by the opposition front bench spokesman, that the government had real concerns that this issue, which I have to say I think is an issue of detail, had acquired such a status with those with whom we were negotiating that it could undermine the government's negotiating position in trying to get the United Kingdom the best possible deal for leaving the EU. Now, I have to say, speaking personally, I found that a difficult thing to accept from my own range of contacts and how I thought the EU is likely to work. But I have to say to the House, I don't think it's an issue which I, as a supporter of the government, can entirely ignore. I am very troubled about Brexit. It's well known in this House that I believe that we have made a historic mistake in voting to leave. I am very open-minded as to what the best course of action should be, whilst respectful of the decision of the electorate in the referendum result. I dislike very much the extent to which we can be fettered or pushed into frameworks of what we have or have not to accept in that negotiation. But that is, if I may say so, a reason why I should also give as much latitude to the concerns of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, as she indicates to me she might have.
Well, my right honourable friend.
No, I wish to conclude. So in those circumstances, I think that there is an issue which I can't ignore. Now, as the House will have noticed, this afternoon a statement was tabled, or was sent, which will be a written ministerial statement tomorrow, by the Secretary of State. The first part of it deals with the position of the Speaker. And of course, if I may put it slightly, the piquancy of this is that having on the one hand said that an unamendable motion to note is an unamendable motion to note in a statute, the fact is it really has absolutely no force at all, because the reality is it's part of the standing orders of this House. It's not open to any interpretation in any court, and it will ultimately be entirely your responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to decide what can or shouldn't be treated as a neutral terms motion. So actually it highlights the fact that although this debate has been about trying to provide assurance, not just in this House, but to many, many members of the public outside who are worried about the end of this process and what might happen. Though it's been designed to provide assurance, the truth is the assurance doesn't lie in the words of the statute, except insofar as the statute is the word of the government. The assurance lies in the hands of this House, and in the first part of this statement, in the power of the Speaker. I then insisted that a second piece be put into it, which I will read out. It says, and if I may say so, it's something which ought to be blindingly obvious. The government recognises that it is open for ministers and members of the House of Commons to table motions on and debate matters of concern, and that, as is the convention, parliamentary time will be provided for this. And the truth is that if this House chooses to debate matters, including matters on which it may wish to have multiple motions, the reality is that if we wish to exert our power to do it, we can. And in the circumstances that might follow a no deal, which would undoubtedly be one of the biggest political crises in modern British history, if the House wishes to speak with one voice, or indeed multiple voices, and compare those, the House has the power to do it. And the suggestion coming from... I shall give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful. The bit I don't understand is, in the last few years, there have been lots of things carried by this House. Motions tabled by the Backbench Business Committee, by the opposition, by ordinary members of the House. The government has just let them go through and then completely ignore them. Yes. The only thing that has legislative effect is legislation. That's why we have to have a meaningful vote, not a pretend one.
Yes, the right honourable gentleman is right, but we take just a pause and consider where we are. If we accepted if the government were to concede the motion as drafted, the amendment as drafted in the laws for an amendable motion, it must be understood by the House that the government could ignore it. And I can assure the House it would not be enforceable in any court of law. No, it's really got to be understood. It would not. It could not be enforceable in any court of law, because that would entirely undermine the rights and privileges of this place. It would be for us to enforce it. And, of course, the ultimate sanction that this House has is a motion of no confidence. But short of that, there are other means by which the House can, in fact, bring its very clear view to bear on the government. Now, in view of that acknowledgement... No, I won't. Sorry. In view of that acknowledgement, I have to say I weigh that and the clear words of this statement against what my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has told me about her anxieties. And my judgment, and it's a purely personal one, is that my view is that if that is the issue, then having finally obtained, I have to say with a little bit more difficulty than I would have wished, the obvious acknowledgement of the sovereignty of this place and its over the executive in black and white language, I am prepared to accept the government's difficulty and support it. I'm prepared to accept the government's difficulty and, in the circumstances, to accept the form of amendment it wants. I'd like to emphasise one other point. I shall formally move at the end of this. I don't wish to deprive the House of the right to vote on this if it wishes. It's absolute right to disagree, but speaking personally, it seems to me that with that acknowledgement having been properly made, I am content to go down that course. And finally, Mr. Speaker, because I want to sit down. Finally, I just want to say this. The difficult... No, I wish to end. Finally, I want to say this. We do face some real difficulties at the moment. It's rightly said that those who the gods want to destroy, they first render mad. And I have to say there's enough madness around at the moment to make one start to question whether collective sanity in this country has disappeared. Every time sensible, reasoned argument tries to be presented in this House, vilification and abuse follows, death threats for right honourable and honourable friends. There is a hysteria which completely loses sight of the issues that we have to really consider. And I have to say there's an atmosphere of bullying which has the directly opposite consequence, that it puts people into a position where they feel that they are unable to compromise, because by doing so they will be immediately described as having lost, as if these were arguments to be lost or won. The issue must be that we get it right. And of course, the other end of the spectrum, Mr. Speaker, we get some really ridiculous things. I've had the Daily Mail crawling over the garden of my house in France. And I don't know quite what they were looking for. I think they were looking for silos in which missiles might be aimed at the mansion of my right honourable friend, and my friend, the member for North East Somerset. There is a history of monsters and witches in the area where I have a holiday home, chucking megaliths backwards and forwards across the channel. Such is the state, Mr. Speaker, of our discourse. But I will just say this. That is the very thing that we must avoid. We are going to have differences, and I finally say to the government this. Those differences may extend to my, as a Member of Parliament, taking a different view if there's no deal from what the government might wish. This House has a right to act if that happens in order to protect the interests of the British people, and the responsibility in those circumstances lies as much with us as it does with the government.
Order. The question is that Amendment B be made. I just very gently point out we have fewer than 45 minutes, and I do want to accommodate other backbench members. Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the chance to take part in this debate. Well, once again, Mr. Speaker, we'll be hearing the siren voices of the hardline no-deal Brexiteers, of whom there are some in this place, claiming that they and they alone have a monopoly on respect for democracy, a monopoly on respect for Parliament, and a monopoly on a patriotic love for their chosen country. They're going to demonstrate their regard for democracy by unilaterally and retrospectively changing the question that was asked in the referendum in 2016, but assuming that the answer will stay the same. They're going to demonstrate their respect for Parliament by doing their damnedest to keep Parliament out of playing any meaningful role in the most important events any of us are ever likely to live through. And they demonstrate their patriotic love for their country by pushing an agenda that threatens to fundamentally damage the social and economic foundations on which their country, and indeed all of our respective countries, were built. Because, Mr. Speaker, there should be no doubt whatsoever about what the hardliners are seeking to achieve here. They tell us that these amendments are about attempting to stop Brexit. But in their private briefings to each other, they tell themselves that they're worried that these amendments might stop a cliff-edge, no-deal Brexit. And, Mr. Speaker, that is precisely what I want these amendments to stop. They're seeking to create a situation where, if, as seems increasingly likely by the day, a severely weakened Prime Minister, possibly in the last days of her Prime Ministership, comes back from Brussels with a miserable deal that nobody can welcome, they want to make sure the only option is to crash out of the European Union with no agreement on anything. And while I hear the Secretary of State's words and warning that you don't go into a negotiation if you can't afford to walk away, can I remind the Secretary of State that on the day the government sent that Article 50 letter, they started to walk away. From that date, they had no deal. the negotiation now is to try to salvage something from the wreckage of that disastrous mistake. The far-right European Research Group would have us believe that their opposition to the amendment is simply about stopping Parliament from being allowed to tell the government what to do. Mr Speaker, I'm no expert in English history, but I thought the Civil War was about whether Parliament had the right to tell the monarch and the government what to do. But the real reason, I'll give way here.
Does the honourable gentleman not see that this Parliament finds itself in a very strange position? This Parliament is actually not wanting to have a vote. In fact, I think they had a vote not to hold a vote, but if they were not wanting to have a vote, it's legitimate to have a vote, not to hold a vote. Absolutely bizarre dereliction of responsibility by this Parliament, and this is why we need Scottish independence and not the mess and the carnage we're seeing in front of us here.
My honourable friend from Nailin and Yar makes a very valid point. That the reason that some in this House are determined not to give Parliament a meaningful vote is because they're worried that an overwhelming majority of parliamentarians on all sides of the House might vote against the cliff edge scenario that they have already plotted out for us. The real reason that some on the opposite benches and even one or two on the opposition benches have to act now to block off the chance of this so-called sovereign Parliament having any powers whatsoever over this is that they know that if they put their true agenda before the House, it will be defeated, and in all probability it will be defeated by a majority that is numbered in the hundreds rather than the tens or the dozens. The government has to be protected at all costs from Parliament because Parliament might do something the government wasn't like. Isn't that what parliaments are for? Especially a parliament in which the government has lost its democratic mandate to form a majority government by its own cynical calling of an unnecessary and disruptive election. The Prime Minister has said, please don't accept these amendments because she doesn't want to have her hands tied. Well, Mr Speaker, it's none of my business whether the Prime Minister likes having her hands tied, her feet tied or anything else tied. But surely the whole point in a parliament is so that there is somebody with democratic credibility and democratic accountability to keep the government in check when it is clear to everyone that the government is going in the wrong direction. I'll give you in a minute. And if plunging over a cliff edge is not the wrong direction, I don't know what is.
Here. And whilst he has indicated that it's not of his business whether the Prime Minister has her hands tied, feet tied or what else, would he accept that it is in the interest of the country for the Prime Minister to have the freedom to go and negotiate the best deal for the country, and Parliament can't negotiate the detail of that deal, only the Prime Minister can do that?
Which country?
Well, Mr Speaker, nothing in the amendment that we're speaking to, or the amendments we're speaking to today, contains any desire for Parliament to be involved in the negotiations. But what we're being asked to believe is that there is no possibility at all that the negotiations will fail. That's what we're being asked to believe, except that those who give us that promise, some of them are hoping that the negotiations will fail, because some of them have already decided that they want to push for a no-deal Brexit, despite the calamitous consequences that were outlined earlier by the right honourable member on the opposition front bench. I'll give way.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for his speech. Does he agree with me that this appears to have more to do with trying to hold the Tory party together, negotiating amongst themselves as we speak, rather than the benefit of the whole United Kingdom?
I think my honourable friend and constituency neighbour makes a very, very valid point. In fact, it's worth remembering the only reason we had a referendum in the first place was because it was going to bring the Tory party together. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? Mr Speaker, the reason that some on the opposite benches get so hot under the collar about the danger of giving Parliament a meaningful vote is because if the House, they say, if the House approves rather than simply considering something, they claim it could subsequently be used as a basis for a legal challenge. Now, I'm not going to gainsay the words of the right honourable and very learned member for Beaconsfield, but what's interesting is that the two cases that they quote in their own document to prove that it could lead to a legal challenge, both of them resulted in rulings that actions of the House, whether it was a resolution, a committee decision or an order of Parliament, did not have the status of an Act of Parliament. Interestingly, one of the cases was about a pornography publisher who sued Hansard for damaging his reputation as a publisher. Mr. Speaker, this briefing also contains a dark warning about what could happen if the government loses the vote at the end of the process. It could undermine the government's authority, it could undermine the government's position. In fact, in their exact words, this could produce an unstable zombie government. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, the briefing doesn't go on to give any indication as to how any of us would be able to tell the difference. But the real giveaway is in the third of the three practical problems they see in the Lord's amendment. Again, quoting directly, Mr. Speaker, it effectively seeks to take no deal off the table. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the real agenda here. I want no deal off the table. The Secretary of State doesn't want no deal, so why is it still on the table? But the intention, Mr. Speaker, is that not under any circumstances will Parliament have the right to pull us back from the cliff edge. It's not just about keeping no deal on the table, it's about making sure that by the time we come to make the decision, there is nothing else on the table other than no deal. Mr. Speaker, in my younger days, which I can just about vaguely remember, I used to be a very keen armchair mountaineer. I loved reading books about mountaineering and hill walking. And one of the books I read was an account of the first ever ascent of the Matterhorn in 1865. Now, the Matterhorn, unlike some cliff edges, didn't have safety barriers. Edward Whymper and his 6 companions got to the summit, but during the descent, 4 of the party fell over a cliff to their deaths after the rope holding the group together had broken. There were, of course, suggestions of foul play and murder most foul, but what had happened was that the rope just wasn't strong enough. In fact, if the rope hadn't broken, it's quite likely that all 7 would have been killed. Mr. Speaker, there are hardline Brexiteers in this House who are determined to drag us over that cliff edge. I want Parliament to be allowed to erect a safety barrier, not to stop those who want to get to the bottom of the cliff from reaching their destination, but to make sure that anybody who gets there in one piece. And while, as I've made perfectly clear before, I have no intention of usurping the democratic right of the people of England to take good or bad decisions for themselves. No one has the right to usurp the democratic decisions of the people of Scotland. And let me just remind the government once again that if they seek to drag their people over the cliff edge, our people are not going to follow. And they might well find, in fact they will find, that there is not a rope in existence that is strong enough to hold Scotland to their country if their country seeks to take us over that cliff edge.
With immediate effect, a 4-minute limit on backbench speeches will apply. Mr. Philip Davis.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all say that I very much agree with my right honourable and learned friend from Beaconsfield about the nature of political debate in this country. He's absolutely right to point that out, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. The second point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that many people in this House seem to forget that there's been 2 meaningful votes. The first meaningful vote was this House deciding to give a referendum to the British people. And the second meaningful vote was the referendum result itself, in which the people voted to leave the European Union. They were meaningful votes. Now, the point, I'm not giving away because time's limited. The point is, Mr. Speaker, is that what's happened since then is that some people who didn't like the result of that referendum, and perhaps didn't even expect the result of that referendum, have now found a newfound enthusiasm for the rights of this Parliament to decide all sorts of things, because they were quite happy for all of these powers to be given over to the European Union willy-nilly. Now they've got this newfound enthusiasm that this House should decide everything. That if only, I'm not going to give away, if that only were the case before. Now, I do excuse from this, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe. He didn't vote to have a referendum, and therefore there is absolutely no reason why he should feel in any way bound by the result of that referendum. And I perfectly respect that. His position has been entirely consistent. What I have no time for, Mr. Speaker, are people... I'm not going to give way, even though he is the father of the House. I'll give way to the father.
Just briefly. to make it clear that this totally irrelevant argument that we're trying to reverse the referendum is as irrelevant to me as it is to any other of my honourable and right honourable friends. This House voted for an enormous majority to invoke Article 50. We're now trying to debate and have parliamentary influence over what we're going to do when we've left and what the form of our new arrangements with Europe and the rest of the world will be. So could he please stop yet again arguing, not just him, I mean, he's the ultimate member to do it, introducing this totally irrelevant argument and trying to say what is wrong with the process actually set out in the Lord's Amendment. What is the excessive power that it apparently gives to this House to have a say when the negotiations are finished?
Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that the public are not fooled by the motives of people who are clearly wanting to delay, frustrate or overturn the result of the referendum. It's a shame some of them can't admit it. The Right Honourable Member, the Shadow Secretary of State, said that people had said over a long period of time that if we did this, Brexit would be frustrated. If we did that, Brexit would be frustrated. Can I suggest to the Shadow Secretary of State, he gets out of London, he gets out a bit, because what people around the country feel is that Brexit is being frustrated. It's already been frustrated by a great deal by this House. And so the idea that he thinks Brexit hasn't been frustrated, he needs to get... Well, my right honourable friend who has taken a vow of independence since he lost his job as a government minister that was never shown before, asked how. I would invite him to get out. He's very welcome up to Yorkshire to actually see what. Well, he speaks to people, Mr. Speaker. He should speak to people. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, is that I'm perfectly content for this House to have a vote. Absolutely, it should have a vote on whether it wants to accept the deal negotiated by the government that it comes back with. Absolutely right that this House votes on whether or not to accept that deal. And the government should accept the vote of this House. What it cannot do, having decided to give the people a vote in a referendum, it cannot find some strange parliamentary mechanism in order to frustrate and overturn the result. He didn't give way and I'm not going to give way either because time is limited. We cannot vote to reverse the decision of the referendum. And people outside this House, Mr. Speaker, need to know this very clearly today, that those people, I'm not going to give way, there isn't time. I want people to know outside of this House that those people today who are voting for this meaningful vote, what they mean is that if the government decides that no deal is better than a bad deal, and it doesn't go to show how out of touch this place is that it's even a contentious statement that no deal is better than a bad deal. I mean, it's a statement of the blindingly obvious, but it's amazing that some people find that a contentious statement. Mr. Speaker, I am not giving way to let other people have time. People should bear that. I'm giving way to the Father of the House. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that the Honourable Eva Broxo doesn't like hearing arguments with which she disagrees, but I'm going to plough on regardless, despite her chuntering from a sedentary position. The point is, Mr. Speaker, that the fact is that no deal is better than a bad deal is blindingly obvious to anybody with even a modicum of common sense. What people in this House are being invited to do is that if the government decide that no deal is better than a bad deal, that this House should somehow be able to say to the government, you've got to continue being a member of the European Union while you go back and renegotiate this and renegotiate that. I cannot stand aside and allow that to happen, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think the British people will thank anybody in this House who votes that way. And let nobody be in any doubt, anybody who votes for this meaningful vote today, their constituents should know they are voting to try and keep us in the European Union against their will.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I say to the honourable gentleman that the argument he's just advanced is not true. It is not true. And the fact is, I think there are a very small number of members of the House who would cheerfully jump over the edge of a no-deal cliff. And that is why we're having this argument this afternoon. Now, I say to the Right Honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield, for whom I have enormous respect, he is right when he says that this is a very fraught, difficult, tense debate. Passions are running high. Given that the referendum split the country right down the middle. That is not entirely surprising. But I would just gently say to him that given the experience he went through last week, where he thought he had an assurance and then discovered that he did not, if I were him, I would be very, very cautious about accepting further assurances. But I respect the decision that he makes. And the reason I would be cautious is for the reason that I put the question to the Secretary of State, who is no longer in his place. I listened very carefully to what the Secretary of State said, and I heard no explanation, no justification and no argument for why the government is prepared for the House to debate an amendable motion to approve the withdrawal agreement, because that is what the Secretary of State indicated when he came before the Select Committee. It's happy to do that, but when it comes to deciding what takes place in the event that the nation is facing the prospect of no deal, the government is insisting on having a motion in neutral terms, which may or may not allow the Speaker to come to the rescue of the House to allow the motion to be declared amendable. But as I read Standing Order 24B, as long as the government does its job in drafting the motion, the Speaker will have no choice but to declare it a motion in neutral terms, and therefore is not amendable. I will give way to my right honourable friend.
Does this not give enormous power to you, Mr. Speaker, which is all very well, because you are a Speaker who has stood up for the rights of this House, for the rights of backbenchers, and for the majority of this House to be able to have meaningful votes. But were Mr. Speaker to fall under a bus in the next few months, what guarantee would there be that a future Speaker would stand up for this House's rights in the same way that you have?
Observe the road safety code. Mr. Hilary Benn.
It's not for me to advise you, Mr. Speaker, but please don't cross any roads between now and the end of this process.
Get an online
it seems to me that the government's intention throughout has been to seek to neuter this House when we come to the end of the process. Because we're talking about the possibility of facing no deal at all. I thought my right honourable and learned friend who spoke from our front bench put it out very, very clearly, because not only would we be facing economic difficulty of the most serious kind, impacts on trade, on our services industry, on our broadcasting, on the security of the nation, because if with no deal in place, how would the exchange of information continue? These are not minor matters. These go to the heart of the government's responsibility to make sure that we are safe and that industry works and taxes are raised and public services are paid for. That is why people are getting exercised about this. This is not some amendment on one bill. It is the most important decision the country has faced for generations. And secondly, as my right honourable and learned friend pointed out, we're not ready. We're not ready to cope with that consequence. And therefore, I just say to members, contemplate this for a moment. If, because the House can't do anything about it, we fall off the edge of the cliff, and future generations look at us and say, what did you do at that moment?
Absolutely.
What did you do? Didn't you say anything? Are we really, as a House of Commons, going to allow our hands to be bound and say, well, at least I took note of what was happening?
Will he give way on that point? Will he give way on that point?
Mr. Speaker, our responsibility is not to take note. It is to take charge, to take responsibility, to do our job. And I will give way to the right honourable and learned gentleman.
I can assure him that if he looks at the standing orders of this House, if this House wants to take charge at that point, it will be able to do so. And I will join with him, if necessary, in doing just that.
Well, I absolutely bow to the right honourable and learned gentleman's expertise, but as my right honourable friend pointed out earlier in the debate, I'm afraid, sitting on these benches with this government, we have seen too many occasions, time and time again, where the House has used the standing orders to debate a matter and pass a motion, and the government sits there and says, we're not taking any notice of you whatsoever. And that is why ensuring that we have the right to amend a motion is now, in the next few minutes, in the hands of this House. There will be no further opportunity to take back control, and I hope the House will do so by voting in favour.
I urge members to help each other. Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful again to the other place for sending us this amendment. This is an issue that I have been concerned about since the referendum, and I have been quite open in my views around the need for a meaningful vote and parliamentary sovereignty. This, in my view, is about our country's future and ensuring that we enhance and not reduce our democracy. When re-elected last year, my constituents were under no illusions about how important I thought a meaningful vote was, as I had already made my concerns public and indeed voted for one during the Article 50 process. Views may differ regarding the desirability of no deal. In my view, it would be utterly catastrophic for my constituents and the industries in which they work. But surely all sides welcome the certainty this amendment brings to the process. We are often accused of wanting to tie the government's hands. Nothing could be further from the truth. How can this amendment tie the hands of the government during negotiations when it concerns steps that should be taken when negotiations have broken down? In other words, it concentrates on events after the end of the negotiations. I support the government's negotiation, and I strongly believe that the Prime Minister will succeed in her negotiation. However, not to have a process in place for what would happen should negotiations collapse would be irresponsible. And what is more, this amendment will ensure that when the Prime Minister sits down to negotiate, our European partners know that she does so with the full backing of Parliament. Far from binding the Prime Minister, it strengthens her hand. And I would encourage all my colleagues to recognise that this amendment empowers both Parliament and our negotiators. It lays out a contingency should disaster strike, and it delivers on a commitment to take back control to Parliament.
Order. A 3-minute limit will now apply. Mr. Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for selecting Amendment A. My pleasure at being able to speak on this is enhanced by the fact that this opportunity came completely out of the blue, but I welcome that. Now, the principal purpose of this amendment is to provide clarity that in all eventualities there will be the opportunity for people to have a final say on any deal that the government strikes, and also that Parliament will not be left stranded with no deal. With that would come closure of our ports, food shortages, medicine shortages and general chaos. And if people on the other side don't believe it, I would advise them to go to talk to the Port Authority at Dover to hear from them what they think no deal would mean. So, Mr. Speaker, I make no apology for the fact that I do want to stop Brexit, and I don't think that probably comes as a surprise to many people in this chamber. But I don't actually believe that the amendment that was put forward today by the Right Honourable Member and Learned Member for Beaconsfield, or indeed my own amendment, would actually achieve it. Brexit is a calamity. We are going to be poorer, more insecure, less influential. We will have fewer friends in the world and more enemies as a result, and that is happening already. Now, some members opposite know it and say it. Some members opposite know it and keep quiet. Some members opposite know it and claim the opposite, and I'm not going to embarrass those who shared platforms with me during the EU referendum campaign who were saying that it would cause calamity but are now claiming the opposite. Some members opposite know it, or in fact some members opposite deny it. Their life's ambition has been to achieve Brexit, and they could not possibly accept that it is now doing us harm. I'm happy to give way.
Honourable Members, a fine speech. To put some numbers on this calamity, it's a no-deal Brexit is an 8% damage event to GDP. For context, the 2008 crash was a 2% damage event to GDP. What the over-the-cliff Brexiteers are looking for is to damage the UK economy 4 times the level of the 2008 crash. Well done, guys.
Absolutely. So we understand the calamity that would be no deal, and that's why I think nobody here nor in the European Union believes that the government would actually settle for that because of the consequences that it would have on our economy. I'll just make a bit more progress in the minute and a half that's left. Now, there would be a chorus of the will of the people from the other benches if time allowed. But the will of the people, 2 points I'd make about that. 2 years on from the 23rd of June 2016, who is clear in terms of what the will of the people now is? And of course, the whole purpose of providing a final say on the deal is to test whether the will of the people is the same now as it was 2 years ago. And the final point I would make is whether we are, as members of Parliament, delegates or representatives. We are elected to use our judgment from the PM downwards, who campaigned to remain because she used her judgment and thought that Brexit would cause us damage. She was right. And would cause damage to communities up and down the country. Many members opposite used their judgment then. I'm afraid that their judgment now seems to have left them. And the government's own assessment confirmed that the impact of Brexit is going to be wholly negative. So the delegates in this House will push on with a policy that is detrimental to British families. The representatives in this House will recognise that a way out of this ideological nightmare that we've got ourselves into has to be found. And so today we will be able to decide, we'll be able to demonstrate which of those two things we are, delegates or representatives.
Thank you. Mr Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think my honourable and right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, got it absolutely right in his response to the chairman of the Brexit Select Committee, that the constitutional power of this House to determine who is in government is entirely unaffected by these amendments or the written ministerial statement that will be laid tomorrow. The powers, the authority of the rights of this House remain intact, and that is not dependent on whether a meaningful vote is amendable or unamendable. Mr Speaker, as an historian of this House and its powers, you know perfectly well that the Norway debate was held on the adjournment of the House, whether it should adjourn or not for the Whitsun recess. That great issue of the time, whether Whitsun should have a few days off, led to a fundamental change in the government and the whole history of our nation that flowed from it. Unamendable motions. I do apologise, the Honourable Lady, I won't give way because other people want to speak and time is very short. So the rights of this House are intact. I think the legislation will ensure that the government can pursue its objectives, and that is very important. And the Chief Whip is in his place, and I would like to commend him for the tactful way he has discussed these issues with so many people over the last week to ensure that we could come to something that everybody on this side of the House is able to agree to and put their names to, that maintains the privileges of this House, ensures the government can negotiate properly, and sends the Prime Minister to the negotiating table, and my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, with a united House of Commons behind him.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today, and I will make just a couple of remarks. Mr Speaker, I want to reiterate the argument, the comments that have been made, that this is not about reversing Brexit and not about tying the hands of the government. This is about what happens and the role of Parliament if things go wrong. Mr Speaker, it is about clarity, about what will happen in this Parliament and in the interest of our country in the event of no deal or no deal being agreed by this House. It is incredibly disappointing to have reached this position. It could have been so different. Mr Speaker, a week after the referendum, I wrote to the then Prime Minister I then wrote to the current Prime Minister, and I made the argument that it was in the interest of our country that this House came together, that we had ways of working across party and across this House, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the other place, and that we came to a solution together and we worked through the issues together. But step by step, Mr. Speaker, we have seen a government that is run and a government that is hidden. A government that has not wanted to even bring forward its own impact assessments so that we can take place in an evidence-based debate about the impact of Brexit on our country and get the answer right. Mr. Speaker, a process by which this country comes together is essential. If what happens in the autumn is that we reach a situation where what was unthinkable becomes thinkable, and to have a way in which we handle that is our responsibility. Mr. Speaker, every large government project has a risk register and has a response to those risks. This is a critical risk for our country, and it is vital that in advance of such a situation we all know what's going to happen and that we have a say on behalf of our constituents for what could be an incredibly catastrophic situation for our economy, our country and our society.
I would like to accommodate further speakers. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I shall make the shortest speech here I've made for very many years and take no interruptions. Well, the government is restricting debate on its European issue as ferociously as it's trying to restrict votes and powers. I voted against both the previous timetable motions. With no explanation, we've been told we've got an hour and a half for this extremely important issue today, presumably in order to allow time for an interesting debate that follows, taking note on the subject of NATO, which could be tabled any time in the next fortnight and has no urgency whatever. So none of us allowed to say very much about it. The government throughout has been trying to minimise the parliamentary role in the process. That is only too obvious. I'll try to avoid repeating anything that others have said, but the fact is it started with an attempt to deny the House any vote on the invocation of Article 50, and it required litigation to change that. And the issue of a meaningful vote has been resisted since it was first proposed, and the government has suffered a defeat in this House at the earlier stages of our proceedings before they would contemplate it, and then they assured us they wouldn't try to reverse that. There would be a meaningful vote. But actually, because that amendment needs amplification, the bill needs to be made clearer, we now have this vital last stage of the Lord's amendments and the final attempt to spell out what meaningful votes and parliamentary influence is supposed to mean, and it's being resisted to the very last moment. Last week, I thought the government was going to be defeated because of its resistance. I was not invited to the negotiations because I don't blame the Chief Whip for that in the slightest. I've not fallen out with him personally, but I think he knew I would take a rather firm line because I saw nothing wrong with Lord Helsham's amendment if nothing else was available. My right honourable and honourable friends, including my right honourable friend for Beaconsfield, actually believed they had undertakings to the Prime Minister, and I believe the Prime Minister gave those undertakings in good faith. He negotiated with a very distinguished member of the government acting on the Prime Minister's behalf, and they reached a firm agreement. That agreement is substantially reflected in the Lord's amendment we have before us now, and they expected that it would be tabled. It was not. And now the government is resisting the very issue upon which a very distinguished member of the government reached a settlement, to use the legal terms, last week, because the government's not be able to live up to its agreement. And we're being asked to substitute, for a perfectly reasonable Lord's amendment, a convoluted thing which will be argued about when we get to what the Speaker's powers if it ever has to be invoked.
Thank you. I'm most grateful to the Father of the House. Mr. Khan? No. Mr. Christopher Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, there are only two issues, I think, that come out of this debate. The first is about honour. The Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield tried to make sure he got a deal from the Prime Minister. He went there with other members to negotiate with her, and she made a promise to him about an amendment. But that promise was not necessarily was not necessarily fulfilled in the interpretation of those members who heard her say that. So the House of Lords had to send back this particular issue today. Now, this issue is definitely about honour because, of course, other members have said they believe that the House can pass resolutions, can pass motions, and even if they aren't necessarily binding, they will be honoured. I believe that the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield is an honourable man, and he's again taking the government at their word, which takes us to the second issue, because this was about Parliament. And if he has achieved anything, he has moved the government from where the Prime Minister was on the Andrew Marr programme on Sunday, when the Prime Minister said, quote, "Parliament cannot tie the hands of government." That's where the Prime Minister was on Sunday. He's managed to extract a statement from the government now saying that it is open for members to table motions, that parliamentary time will be provided, and that it is open for this House and through the Speaker to make sure that motions and decisions can be made. He believes that this is worth having, and it is indeed true that this is a step forward. The difference that I have with him is he believes that the Prime Minister and the government should be given the benefit of the doubt yet again. I would suggest that he shouldn't and couldn't necessarily trust their word. That is where we differ.
2-minute limit. Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. There is just one fundamental point which I would like to make about this debate, and that is this, that the decision that was taken in the Referendum Act by 6-1, the primacy of this House of Commons and in the House of Lords which endorsed it, was to accept that the people of this country would make the decision and not 650 members of Parliament when that decision was taken in the referendum. One word I only need to say about that is this, that we operate in this country and under our constitutional arrangements under a system of parliamentary government, not government by Parliament.
And Mr. Chris Bryant, 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, when I was training to be a priest in the Church of England, my professor of systematic theology was called John Macquarie, and he would often say that he was often asked by parishioners, what is the meaning of God? But actually, the far more important question is, what is the meaning of meaning? And to be honest, that's what it feels as if this afternoon's debate and last week's debate has been about. What is a meaningful vote? And the first answer is a meaningful vote is surely not one which is meaningless. We had a meaningless vote on Monday afternoon on the SO24 debate. It was meaningless because we were considering whether this House has considered the matter of the Sewell Convention. Even if every single member of the House had voted against that, we would nonetheless have considered the matter. This is exactly what we do in statutory instruments as well. We vote on whether we have considered the matter. The government's motion will require the government, not allow the government, require the government to table a neutral motion. And I would just disagree with the honourable member for Somerset North East. He said that the vote in 1940 was on the adjournment. It wasn't. It was on whether this House should adjourn for a successive number of days, which was an amendable motion and had effect. And would have had effect. I'm not going to give way to him if he doesn't mind. It was an amendable. I'm not. Oh, all right.
I did say it was on the Whitsun recess. I think I covered that point.
But you managed to, the honourable member managed to elide the fact that it was an amendable motion and had effect. The point is here, if the government does what its motion says it should do, namely table a neutral motion, I do not think that the written ministerial statement gives the Speaker any power whatsoever to decide that it is not a neutral statement. It gives him absolutely no power. And indeed, if a Speaker were to decide that a neutral motion was suddenly somehow or other not neutral and could be amended, we should remove the Speaker from the chair because he would not be abiding by the standing orders of this House. So, let us make it absolutely clear. Let us make it absolutely clear if it's a neutral motion, it will be a motion that has no meaning whatsoever.
Tewbury.
That's Mr. Speaker.
Oh, no.
That's out of order. Mr. Speaker, I am concerned that the editor of the Daily Mail has made a small doll that looks like me and is sticking pins in its throat. Because every time I want to speak, I get this wretched infection. But I want to make some very important points, if I may. I completely agree with all the arguments advanced by the Honourable Member for Edinburgh, and history will record what a remarkably brave woman she has been throughout all of this. And I too will be voting for this amendment because I agree with much of what has been said. This needs to be in statute. Now, I'm going to pay real tribute to my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, who has yet again shown outstanding leadership and courage, as indeed have many honourable members in the House of Lords. And in tribute to them, if nothing else, I shall be voting for this amendment. But primarily, I shall be voting for this amendment because it's in the interests of all my constituents. I was elected to come here to represent all of them. That's the 53% that didn't vote for me, and it's the 48% that voted to remain. You've been sidelined and abused, and the big mistake that we have made is from the outset of all that has followed from the referendum result, we have not included them. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I would say gently to the member for Shipley, what he has to remember is that there are honourable members who will be voting with the government today as an act of faith and trust in the Prime Minister, that sort of comment will no longer exist in this party, and that we will be more united. And it's her role, if I may say, to make sure that we have more temperate speeches.
Mr. George Howarth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, I hold the right honourable learned gentleman for Beaconsfield in very high regard for his integrity and his fluency. I do, however, say very gently that he is in danger of turning into a modern-day Grand Old Duke of York. And there are only so many times you can march the troops up the hill and down again without losing completely integrity. I just want to, in the little time that's remaining to Mr. Speaker, to talk about negative motions, which is the centre of this dispute.
Order. The question is that Amendment B be made. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Aye. Division. Clear the lobby. Order.
The ayes to the right, 303. The noes to the left, 319.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 303. The noes to the left, 319. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. The question is the government motion that this House agrees with the Lords in their amendments 19C to 19E, 19G to 19L, and 19P, and proposes the amendments to Lord's Amendment 19P as on the amendment paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. I must now put a single question to agree with the Lords in all of the remaining Lords' proposals. I simply remind the House of that with which I feel sure it is closely familiar. 4B to 4E, 24C, and 110B to 110J. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.